The unlanded generation. It's great to come on after a talk which has explained why those at the top of society don't think there is a problem and why there isn't a problem for them at the moment. And also a talk that began with the cycle of doom. The 6 boxes where banks can simply create money, they lend money, that money results in house prices rising, people become more insecure about their jobs and futures and pensions, and so some people try to become landlords, which increases prices even more. And as was said at the start, the cycle of doom is not sustainable. That's fine, that's how it should look. I know it looks weird, if I've only got one to explain to you. And it's also great to have a question about, well, how do we communicate the problems to people? Now, this may not be the best way to communicate the problems to people, but I got this map into The Guardian in August, I think around the 22nd of August. And I want to explain to you how I made it and why I think it matters. Because while people at the top of society think that they will be all right and that most of their children will be all right, they're not going to do anything about it. And no matter how much you try to agitate and to do things, if that top of society is big enough and they control political power, your agitation won't have much effect. Housing movements in the north of England and in Scotland and some in Wales have had some effect because land values are cheaper. In the southeast and London, almost nothing has happened, and the problem is the price of the market. This map was made simply by going to Zoopla. If you go to Zoopla and type in the name of a county, Zoopla will give you an average price for that county. It will also tell you how many properties were sold in the last 12 months and the last 3 months in that county. And it will tell you the average prices for those times. Zoopla data is largely based on the land registry, but they update it a couple of times a week with all other kinds of weird data that they won't quite tell you what it is, including estimates that people put in of their own properties. But it's the best we've got, and after 3 months, we know from the land registry what's really happening. What Zoopla data revealed by August the 22nd this year was that in every single county of England, Zoopla were recording a lower average housing price than they had been over the last 12 months. So that is a map of England where every area is the size of the amount of money lost to the housing market because house prices had fallen. Now, the total area, I think, is £4 billion. That's nothing. You could go from here, I think, to the plain on the Cowley Road, and the properties along both sides of the road would actually be worth £4 billion. A very small house price fall occurred, but it was a fall everywhere. London is £1 billion. £1 billion is simply a medium-sized street in Chelsea. It's ridiculous. The majority of our wealth is held in housing. Kensington, Chelsea and Westminster are now worth more than the whole of Denmark, supposedly. You get these statistics every so often. There was a point in 1989 when the Imperial Gardens in Tokyo were judged to be worth more than the whole of California. That point was reached within months of the most almighty housing crash in world history. House prices halved in Japan and are still down there. But you get these strange moments. The key thing isn't actually the strange map and the size of the areas, it's the colours. And the colours are key because the red is showing places, the dark red, where transactions have fallen by 70% or more. People are simply not buying and selling houses like they were 12 months ago. And the best you get is the pale pink areas in the north, where transactions had only fallen by 65%. We may be at the beginning of the end of the speculative bubble in housing. We know an end has to come, and that's really easy, because every speculative bubble in world history ends. We also know it's very hard to predict when a bubble will end. Markets are inherently unpredictable. By their very nature, they are unpredictable. But it isn't impossible when a bubble begins to come to an end to actually say it is beginning to end. What is really interesting at the moment, though, is that nobody's saying it, because it now is so much not in the interests of a minority of people in Britain, but the people who write newspaper articles, the people who work for estate agents, the politicians, actually saying that we might be at the peak worries people far too much because of what the implications of a fall in house prices might be. I'm concentrating on this rather than worrying about renting and landlords and cooperative housing schemes and the homeless, because if and when this begins, it changes everything. Once people at the top of society begin to worry that they are not well served by how we organise our housing, new things become possible. So that appeared in The Guardian in August. Yesterday, I got a blog into the New Statesman magazine, which they very helpfully didn't take my very academic and boring title, and instead they put Brexit means the end to rises in house prices, which isn't quite what I'm saying, but it does fine from my point of view. Because there is more and more evidence from the financial press, not the FT, not the Telegraph, not the Guardian, but from the press where the financial people involved in housing write to each other, saying that they are finding more evidence that sales have absolutely frozen up, things are being sold for less. It began at the top of market in London. A £30 million house will now go for 25 million. But all the way down the London markets, it's gone, apart from the very bottom. Very bottom, you're talking about 340,000. And those are now being snapped up by landlords as a bargain. And because they don't want to buy anything for more than that. And this is worth understanding. How many of you know Jericho in Oxford? Got an idea we're in Oxford, so we're going to talk about Oxford. Okay, you've got an idea. Half of you know Jericho, half of you are not going to get this. Jericho, there was one point where it was going to be demolished when I was born in it, because it was a slum. You can now buy a tiny 2-bed cottage for £1 million. Nice bricks, but it's tiny. That tiny 2-bed cottage for £1 million, terraced, I reckon you could get 20,000 a year, unless somebody's being really snobby, because you can't get 4 students into it. You can get one young professional family, maybe 20,000 a year. That's a 2% return on your million. Why would you buy that as a landlord for a 2% return? Because you've got costs as a landlord. You've got to make sure the boiler works. You've got to do other things. There are ways of making more money out of your money than 2%, as I've learned from starting work at this university and discovering where its endowments are invested. Right? If you're making, if you really want to make money, 2% is not a good return, especially with inflation coming. So why are people buying houses at these rates, and particularly landlords? Because the house itself will rise in value, has been rising in value for years. So if the house rises by 5% and you're getting 2% from your tenants, that's a 7% return, it's not so bad. And when other returns don't look so bad, that's fine. But if you begin to see this, and the stories that have come out more recently than this, saying that the market is dodgy, then what the estate agents are saying is we might have a 1% fall next year. That's them being as optimistic as they can. Then suddenly you can't factor in making money out of the property as a landlord. The government have also changed the rules for landlords, so you can't claim tax exemptions and other things fairly soon. Cherie Blair went to the High Court on behalf of landlords. Do you remember things could only get better in 1997? Things are going to get better, and the Prime Minister's wife represents the landlord class, and lost, to the Conservative government who are taking away tax breaks for private landlords. Set up your own company, though, and you can still dodge tax as a landlord. We're on the edge of something very interesting potentially beginning to happen. At the same time, who remembers Help to Buy? Has anybody used Help to Buy? Come and tell me afterwards. Help to Buy in London would let you get a house rather like that tiny two-bed house in Jericho for, say, 590,000 if you could find it in a less salubrious borough, because it will cost you more than that in a salubrious borough. 590,000. You can, with just a 5% deposit, so what's that? You've only got to find 20-odd thousand. You can buy that house. We will give you a 40% mortgage from the government, and then a bank will lend you the rest. Because all the banks can make up money, they can't make up money in completely idiotic ways. So the banks were not willing to lend this money. So George Osborne introduced Help to Buy, and we've been lending people money to keep the housing market up. You may not have noticed that what George Osborne did while he was Chancellor is spend as much money as he could of what money he had. Didn't have to cut everything, he did spending. All the spending was to push house prices up. All the schemes were to push house prices up. Why? Because he and the people around him believed that high house prices were a sign of success. The successful part of a city is the expensive part of a city. London, being the most expensive large city of the planet, isn't a problem. It just shows we're economically vigorous or something. They believe that, and they spend money trying to push the house prices up. They also know that they lose elections if house prices fall. That's what George Osborne did, right to the moment when he was sacked. Philip Hammond is cancelling Help to Buy in December. It's going. Quite quietly. Why is he doing that? Because if you think house prices are starting to fall, you do not lend people 40% of the value of an asset that's about to fall. Another reason why we may be on the edge of this, apart from the fact it's unaffordable, the only reason that house prices cost so much in this city is landlords buying. You're competing with landlords if you try to buy. And overseas investors. There are a few in North Oxford, there are many more in London. Now, imagine you're in China. You own 3 factories. You've got 1 daughter. You've got some spare millions. You've invested in the Shanghai housing market and you've had your fingers burnt in the crash. And you've bought a flat in an empty luxury block just south of the River Thames. And that flat cost you a couple of £1 million there. But remember, you're from China, so you don't think in pounds. You think in your own currency. What's just happened to the value of your investment since the 23rd of June 2016? And why did you leave that flat empty? Now, okay, the rent was hardly worth picking up. That's why the flats are empty. But also, you've had your fingers burnt in Shanghai before. There have been housing crashes around the world before. Pound dropping gets to a point where it really is worth bailing out and just accepting your loss and getting your cash. And we haven't thought about this yet, but that's another reason as to why, particularly in London, we should expect house prices to fall. Because it's a really, really unsafe investment for overseas investors now, since that vote. Every time Theresa May says Brexit is Brexit, the pound drops down another time. And that's great. I mean, in a way, and I will draw this conclusion and say, in a way it's great. I've talked to people who voted leave. They're unlikely to be in this room because Oxford's a weird place, 70% remain. I was one of those. And the most common thing you get from mostly elderly people who voted leave was, I want my grandchildren to be able to house themselves. It's the most common thing. I want my grandchildren to be able to house themselves. And they can't at the moment because housing costs too much. The rent is too much and buying it's too much. I'm not saying everybody should buy a house, but we know we've got a problem. They've been told by the newspapers for years that the reason housing costs lots is immigration. But it's not immigration. because we actually have more housing now per person than we've ever had. We have built lots of rooms, we haven't built many houses and flats, but we extended them. We've got more bedrooms per person than we've ever had. We're using housing incredibly efficiently. But they voted leave because they wanted house prices to fall. Even though often they actually owned a property, they have enough grandchildren to realise that if they were to leave their money to their grandchildren, it doesn't get their grandchildren housed, unless you've got one grandchild, and we're not in China. So there is a constituency out there which will actually welcome the value of land and the value of housing falling. It needs people to say it is falling when it is falling. Estate agents aren't going to do this. I can remember 1989, I used to get the data. 89 was our last, apart from 2008, our last housing crash. It's a long time ago. We used to get 10 floppy disks from a building society every month. And then one month, this was October 89, after the September crash, they only sent me one disk. And I phoned up and said, what's gone wrong? And they said, that's it. Because what really falls is transactions, the number of properties selling. Prices fall later. And when you go from 10 floppy disks to one floppy disk, you have to sack 9 out of 10 estate agents. And that's what happens to estate agents. So the entire estate agency business is really trying hard to soften this fall. The man who makes most money from Zoopla is one of the men who's taken the government to court over Brexit, to say there has to be a vote in Parliament. Because the worst thing that can happen for Zoopla is Brexit. So he's trying to change that. You can look yourself, there are various ways you can do it, and you can help say that this thing is beginning. If you want another reason to think that it is inevitable, because you may be thinking, oh, can't they just rebound and go up and up in price? In 10 years' time, the vast majority of first-time buyers in their early 30s will be university graduates. Half of all young women go to university. They almost all have student debt. That student debt will range between 56,000 and 100,000 if they got a slightly higher paid job. So we know that unless we go to an entirely landlord-led market in 10 years' time, that my sector, the higher education sector, has taken a bite out of the future housing market. So it's going to go at one point. I think it's beginning to go now. And when it goes, the complacency of people who think that their property is an asset, is going to pay for their pension, begins to go. When it begins to fall, the faster you sell your house and move to something smaller, if there's just you and 4 bedrooms in that house, the better off you'll be. And the better off people will be that you're going to leave money to. But it's not just that. The entire ethos of this was a good way to operate things begins to go. And that's why it is really worth checking now and saying now the private market is precarious. Then, and very usefully, you put up 2 minutes, so I don't have to give solutions. Then what do you do? So if you say the private market is precarious, and we have had the biggest speculative boom in that market that we've ever had, housing has become the most unaffordable it has been since at least the 1920s for most people. You don't simply say, we'll carry on like this in 5 or 10 years' time when things get back to normal. You do begin to say, we need new models for things. We need people to have the right to sell their house to a housing association and stay as a tenant. When and if we do build just a few apartments around the edge of Oxford, cycling only, when we do build them, they must not be built by Barrett's. They must be green, because the model doesn't work. The scope for changing things is absolutely enormous after what we are very near to getting. We changed our housing system radically after the 1929 crash. We're still living through the repercussions of the 2008 crash, and we've managed to dampen it down. And like the rest of the periphery of Europe, at this point, all different forms of housing will become possible, should become possible. Cooperative housing, community land trusts, those kind of things that people have been arguing for years and years and years, can suddenly have a place. And so I think there is a reason to be optimistic, but I cannot see a way of getting what people want without the private market failing. And I'm worried that we may be delaying a failure simply by keeping sentiment going if people say, oh no, house prices can never fall, even as they actually are beginning to fall. Thank you very much.